all right, sir, and yourself?
That's what he thinks he is.
No, we just corrected any contamination. That's our role in it.
Joe's a project manager.
Joe's going to give the presentation.
So the only thing I'm going to do, before Joe does his presentation, I'm going to get up and I'm going to say, ask them and then I'll monitor the crowd. So he has to control.
He's probably running out of the microphone.
But if they need a microphone,
Yeah, I can. You can moderate. Then you're still moderating.
Yeah, you can.
You might have to take a picture.
Absolutely.
So you try to say we're out here we're doing this work.
yeah, Jeff Kelly wants lots of pictures.
Yeah, because we have 2 video cameras.
Oh, they're great.
I'm a little worried.
This is my fan club.
All right, so so I think we're all set, right? Mario, how do you say your last name? Mangino. That's Italian.
He's Kentucky.
He's a Southern boy.
Well, Raphael, you're Italian too, right?
Yes, we are.
Okay, our mic was kind of going in and out here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this down. Hello? Because I think, can you all hear me? Okay? All right. So I want to thank you all for coming today. What we've done is that with the development of the Hoover District that IRG owns, we've got 1,100 new jobs in there, and we've got people working. We've brought in about $500,000 on average in income tax collections. So the first phase of the development has been a great success. The second phase, as we move into, or what we would refer to as the second phase, we have the residential units and the retail units. And of course, you know, that has been stalled for a number of years. And one of the areas or requirements that have to be met in order for this project to move forward is that the EPA requirements have to be met. So in brief summary, what we know, because we've had a lot of good communication with the US EPA representatives that are here, these gentlemen that are sitting next to me, and I would like to introduce them. We have Michael Beadle, and Michael is the Corrective Action Division Chief, right?
Section chief.
Section Chief.
You're giving me promotion.
Okay. And then we also have Rafael Gonzalez, and Rafael is the Public Affairs Specialist. We have Joe Kelly, who's the EPA Project Manager, and we also have Mario Mangino, and Mario is the EPA Risk Assessor and Toxologist. And so we've had a number of conference calls. Myself, Mark Soretta, Daryl Revolt, also Patrick Diorio, our administrator. So there's been a number of discussions that we've had, you know, over the past, I'd say, year and a half or so. in relation to the Hoover District and the requirements that need to be met. I will let them elaborate on it more, but really what it comes down to is whenever you have a brownfield or an old industrial site, when there's contaminants in the soil, you have to make sure that you're addressing those the brownfield issues. You want to make sure you have good, clean drinking water. That's not a problem here because we've got a great water treatment plant and we have good groundwater lines that run in and feed the system. We don't have independent water wells down there that people are drawing water from. So the water is not compromised. The drinking water is clear and safe. And then you also look at the vapors that are given off from the soils. But it's similar to, anybody in here have a radon system in their home? Like I do? You have a system that evacuates vapors, ground vapors, that could be potentially harmful. What you do is you remediate it. You put in a gas extrusion system or a vapor extraction system, and you clean it out. And that's very similar to what the EPA is requiring of IRG. It's just on a much bigger scale. So they put in more vapor systems and they set up regular ongoing monitoring. And we've been really pleased with the fact that they've come all the way from Chicago to come out here and to make sure that we're addressing all of the concerns and issues that we have as a city and more importantly that our residents have. And so with that, I will turn it over. Raphael, you're going to get this started here.
Real quick.
Thank
Good
you.
evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Raphael, as the mayor has mentioned. Just a couple of ground rules before we start. First of all, if you didn't get a chance to sign in, please sign in. We're going to share the list. And no doubt, we like to send out fact sheets and other information. If we have your address, if you don't already have it, that fact sheet comes in real handy. The second thing is, we will ask you to let Joe finish his presentation before you start the questions. So that at the end of his presentation, which shouldn't be more than 20 minutes, 25 minutes, we'll have a Q&A. And so we'll take every question until they kick us out of here. The other thing is, if there's any press here, if the press is here, please come see me if you want to interview one of the project people or one of the people up here so that we can coordinate that. Other than that, Joe, you're on.
Thanks. I may go without this microphone if that's okay with everybody. Thank you, Mayor Howell and council members for having us here. My name is Joseph Kelly. I'm the project manager with EPA. I've been with EPA about 7 years. Before that, I worked as an environmental consultant doing the same types of cleanups as the one that's going on at the Hoover property here. I'm going to speak to about 3 different things. One is the past work that was done at the property by Hoover. Another thing is the past work done at the property by Maple Street Commerce or IRG. And another thing is the work that's proposed by Maple and IRG. Most of you probably know a lot about this site, maybe more so than I do. It began electric sweeper manufacturing around 1908. At one point it grew to 86 acres. That's outlined in red there from this aerial photo. The current property boundary is the yellow line up at the top, and everything the same to the south. Manufacturing occurred in 30 buildings, consisting of about 1 million square feet of manufacturing. It was a pretty good size operation, as you guys know. This property became subject to hazardous waste regulations when it submitted a permit to store hazardous waste in a drum storage area on site. They began investigation around the mid-1990s to evaluate whether there was contamination, and that work continues through to today. Over the course of time, several ownership changes occurred, and we signed an administrative order in 2016 with the current owner. The prior company was under a voluntary agreement, meaning it was at their disclosure the work that they did. This slide shows a number of areas. Hoover did a number of manufacturing operations, included die casting, alloying, metal finishing, motor manufacturing, plating, painting, assembly, and degreasing. Those operations generated wastes, which were handled in these areas shown on this map. We call them solid waste management areas under EPA. That's areas where they handled contamination and wastes. When Hoover conducted their assessment, they identified that there was trichloroethylene, TCE, also PCE or tetrachloroethylene, along with vinyl chloride, which is a breakdown product of both of those chemicals, PCBs, and certain metals in the soil and in the groundwater. Most of the impacts that we're dealing with here are volatile organic compounds. They're the most widespread at this property. They're also some of the more hazardous compounds, and a lot of the contamination that we found on site here stems from spills that occurred throughout the manufacturing process, and then also waste disposal that occurred before there were those types of laws to either regulate or prevent those types of activities. The contamination was heaviest in the central part of the property, that cluster of solid waste management units. At one point, contamination extended off-site to the west, below the residential area, about 1,000 feet. Over time, volatile organic compounds have come to light because of vapor intrusion concerns. Vapor intrusion is when, if you think about a cup of coffee and vapors come off the top of it when it's hot, the same kind of thing happens with contamination below ground. And we took a look at some of the past areas of contamination, considering what we now know about TCE as a contaminant, and also what we know about vapor intrusion as a process. And we wanted to reevaluate areas of the property where we thought there might be problems. The area outlined in yellow there that has some of the blue circles are locations from past Hoover samples, where if we looked at them today, they might be considered a problem. In addition, considering that this site was undergoing redevelopment or it's planned, we wanted to look at some of the current buildings, and that's shown in the red dash there in the bottom of the slide. So I just want to present a 30,000-foot view of some of the data that we collected. This is sampling results from a building along Maple at Taft Avenue, indoor air samples. You'll see a lot of different contaminants there. I'm also showing up in the upper right-hand corner on all of the slides, I've got screening criteria for what's an acceptable level for either a residential property or an industrial commercial property. And I've got the screening criteria for that type of property use circled in blue so that you can see for reference what the acceptable levels are. You see a lot of different contaminants here. I'm going to speak a little bit about some of the ones that we don't view as a problem, but I'm also going to speak to some of the ones that were there. TCE, we know that's a contaminant at the site. It was above screening criteria at one sampling location, collected at multiple events here. And the remainder of the samples were generally favorable within the building. I didn't show the other results. The results were basically clean. That location where TCE was collected, or where the TCE was present in the sample, is a utility corridor below the building. It's unoccupied. So even though it's above the screening criteria, people aren't being exposed to it. They're not coming in contact with it because they're not going into that space. The samples collected on the main floor were all favorable. I mentioned some other contaminants though. Naphthalene, I've highlighted there as one of the contaminants that exceeded indoor air criteria. I want to speak a little bit about naphthalene. It's found in a lot of different products. It's found in petroleum products, tar, asphalt, cigarette smoke, car exhaust, smoke from forest fires, insecticides, pest repellents, pesticides. It's used in making PVC plastics. It's in dyes, resins, leather, tanning agents, mothballs, toilet deodorant blocks. It's used in rubber processing, and it's in pharmaceuticals. And it's also one of the main components in creosote, which they preserve telephone poles with. So the fact that we see it there doesn't necessarily mean it's something that's related to Hoover, because it's everywhere. And the other thing that I want to point out about this location with TCE, some of the future slides you'll see an area, this location is where Hoover previously did a cleanup for a former vapor degreaser, and so we're not surprised to find it in this area. It was one of the reasons we wanted Maple Street Commerce to sample there. So in addition, there's another couple of contaminants, 1,4-dichlorobenzene. I don't know if it's in this, I think it's in the next sample. These are contaminants that we see frequently related to other products, and so just because they're in the air sample doesn't necessarily mean that they're related to Hoover. Another building along Maple, this one now closer to Maine, we found TCE again in indoor air at one location above the criteria. This building has an underground parking garage. One thing about TCE and PCE is they're heavier than air, so they tend to sink to lower spaces, and we think that's why we're seeing these all on lower levels as opposed to upper floors. Again, this is an unoccupied space. People drive into it. They're in it for short periods of time before they go into the building. So it's a concern, but we view it as a really kind of a small concern in the grand scheme of things. Some of the other contaminants there, benzene, naphthalene again, 1,2,4-trimethylbenzene. These are petroleum products. And again, this is an underground parking garage, so we're not surprised to see these types of materials there. When we sampled the upper floors, though, the occupied spaces, you'll see we didn't have samples with exceedances. We had contaminants present, but nothing above screening criteria, with the exception of 1,4-dichlorobenzene. That was collected from a second-story sampling location. 1,4-dichlorobenzene is related to, or it can be used in toilet deodorant blocks for janitorial type supplies. And that location was collected outside of janitorial closets, so again, there's a reason why it's there that may not necessarily be related to Hoover. Samples from the building collected, or it's situated on Orchard. This sample, or these samples, had no contaminants in indoor air above screening criteria. We think that it's probably because the building is newer. The floor, the concrete floor, may be more substantial to prevent contamination from getting into the building. The samples collected from the soil and the groundwater and the soil gas in this area are very high, so that's it's a good thing that this barrier is preventing contamination from coming inside. The other buildings here, currently unoccupied, although we had favorable results again from the indoor air. It's unlikely that these are going to be used, and there's nowhere there now. So one of the things that we did, in addition to the indoor air samples, we collected soil vapor samples. This is the vapor that's below the ground that hasn't come into the building. When we sat down with the results that Maple Street Commerce collected, we saw some relatively high screening results close to some property lines. And as a result of that, we wanted to make sure that everything was okay for people living off-site from the Hoover facility. I'm not going to talk a lot about some of these private properties. We met with Ohio EPA to address properties that we thought were a potential concern. And we also reached out to Stark County Health to discuss approaching folks to do indoor air sampling. What I am going to talk about is some of the private properties that were close by, that were public places, city-owned properties, and places that are daycares and schools and things like that. And specifically one property where we did find a problem. So this is kind of downtown North Canton. When we did sampling at the Christian Community Church, we found a problem in indoor air. Originally, the sample was okay, and the second sample that we collected was contaminated. At that point, we began with IRG and also the church to increase the ventilation in the building, open the windows up so that this material wasn't trapped in the building. Maple Street Commerce installed a carbon filter in the heating and air conditioning system so that air that was passing through would have the contaminants filtered out. And they also installed a sealed cover over a sump in the basement so that the hole in the floor wasn't allowing contamination to come up from below the ground. We simultaneously then at that time began working with them on the design of a sub-slab vapor depressurization system. This is similar to a radon system. I have one in my house. The idea behind this is that it collects vapors from under the floor slab, vacuums them out so that they're not entering the building space. Around that same time, we started working with Maple on the design for a mitigation system for the West Factory that's currently being proposed for redevelopment. Again, now I've highlighted screening criteria in blue here for this bank or the church property. That property, it's really has more like commercial uses, which would allow higher criteria. But because of the fact that children are in there, we want to make sure that this building is clean and it's meeting the most stringent criteria. And so that was part of the reason for installing a mitigation system. Again, you see a number of different contaminants in samples around there, but for example, I mentioned naphthalene. That's primarily what we're seeing in these samples above screening criteria. We don't necessarily know that that's from Hoover, whereas we do know that TCE is one of the contaminants that was handled there. So this shows a basic diagram for a sub-slab system. It's basically a series of holes cut in the floor slab, connected to a pipe that has a vacuum attached to it, a vacuum fan that extracts the vapors from under the floor, vents them to the exterior, preventing contamination to enter the existing building. I've shown here on this figure kind of a real basic summary of the work that Maple Street Commerce did when we asked them to start looking at this site. A total of 34 soil borings were installed by Maple. That's to supplement what work that Hoover already did in the 1990s through 2000s. They installed 74 soil vapor sampling locations. Those locations also have a co-located air sample, so there's a soil vapor sample and an air sample. We installed 8 monitoring wells to supplement the 43 wells that Hoover had originally installed on the property. The results show contamination persists. That's not surprising. The site's been contaminated for a long time, and it is probably going to remain that way. One thing that is positive is that you can see these areas that were solid waste management units pretty much line up with the areas where we found contamination. So we're not seeing things that are tremendously surprising. And some of the other things that are positive about this is that the exposures, both on-site and off-site, from what we've obtained so far and what we know, appear to be relatively limited. So another concern, there was off-site groundwater contamination. This slide shows some on-site data, but also off-site data that had been monitored. Hoover had proposed that contaminants off-site were going to start reducing after they performed some cleanup in some limited areas. And from what we see here, it does appear to be the case off-site. Conditions are much favorable, and in some cases they're between 3 and 10 times lower levels of contamination than when Hoover left the property in 2006, 2007. I mentioned design for the West Factory. Again, this is undergoing redevelopment for various uses. We found high levels of soil gas contamination below the slab. The indoor air sampling was not close to nearly as bad as what soil gas concentrations were. But given that it was being redeveloped and that there was going to be a residential component for use, we wanted them to install a mitigation system to, again, prevent air from coming into the building that would be contaminated. So this is a schematic for what's proposed for the mitigation system that Maple designed for this property. All of these areas with red dots shown are individual pipes that penetrate the concrete floor, that are going to be connected to vacuum fans that suck the contamination out. This work was submitted to EPA as an interim remedy in February 2017, so a little bit over a year ago, and we approved this proposal in March of 2017. Again, this is part of the short-term solution. We're going to be getting a long-term plan in for the property, and at that point, we're also going to present that to the public, and again, likely ask for comments on what Maple has proposed for the site. So given that we're going to have people in the building and that we're taking contamination from below the slab and we're venting it to the building roof, we wanted to make sure that people are not going to be exposed to contamination. We requested from Maple Street Commerce a series of samples to be collected. We're targeting some areas with sampling locations in green and blue around some of the stacks for this SBE system. Again, this is like a radon system, but now this is a much larger scale because of the size of the building. We're going to be targeting the locations that had higher levels of soil gas contamination for air sampling to make sure that when they start the system up, that things are not coming into the air and making a problem worse. We're also going to have sampling inside the building and other ongoing activities to make sure that the system operates effectively and protects people in the community. So another component of Maple's proposed work is additional investigation. Some of this work is ongoing at the facility right now. What we're doing is supplementing some of the work that Hoover previously completed, trying to answer some questions. You can see a lot of work here is proposed around the church to find out why exactly we have a problem there, or had a problem. And I apologize, I forgot to mention in one of the past slides there with the church, we conducted sampling in the church after we found a problem, and through the installation of the system and operation of it, the air in the church is now clean. So that's another positive component. I apologize for glossing over that. But we want to find out why it had a problem, and so that's why some of this work is targeting that area. We also want to answer questions in the south of the property where we don't have a lot of information. What we do have is favorable. We have clean samples all the way around it. We have clean samples off-site, and we have clean samples off-site over here. So we're trying to narrow in on where contamination is and how it's moving around below ground. There's also an area where the former plume was located, which is up in the north part of the site there. We want to try to answer some questions to make sure the right depths have been sampled and that we're not missing any contamination from that area that was previously assessed. So one thing about a site like this, there's a lot of contamination that has to be properly managed. It's not practical to dig up everything. That's just not the way our program works. The way we manage contamination is through different types of restrictions. Some areas of this property have no restrictions right now because contamination was at such low levels that there's no need to restrict its use. There's an area, both on-site and off-site, that currently has a groundwater use restriction. That's the Stark County groundwater resolution. And it prevents the installation of wells for use of drinking water, and it also prevents the use of wells. Some areas of the site are going to be restricted for non-residential use, meaning commercial. Some are going to be restricted for non-agricultural use, which this is all based on the levels of contamination and also the types of contamination. There's another type of safety measure called a construction worker protection. This is a notification for somebody who may come along and dig in an area of contamination in the future. It's to notify them that there's contamination and that they should take appropriate precautions. Sometimes paired with that is a soil management requirement, or soil management plan. Some people call it a no-dig plan. Really what this is not to say you can't dig, but so that if people dig in an area where there's heavy contamination, that contamination is then handled in accordance with the laws, both the state and federal regulations. We knew about a vapor intrusion restriction. That's really the point of most of the work that we've been doing lately. That type of restriction covers either sampling or the presumption that if you build a new building, that you will install some sort of system to, like the radon type of system, the subslab system. You will assume you have to install that so that contamination in the soil isn't coming into a new building that doesn't currently exist. And then the last type of control is an engineered barrier. This is like a hard surface in asphalt or concrete. And usually things that line up with those types of restrictions are requirements to make sure that the barrier hasn't degraded, broken down, and cracked and crumbled. And then to inspect it periodically to make sure that it's still in good condition. So those are the types of restrictions that were proposed to be used at the former Hoover site. And they're used in various combinations in different areas based on levels of contamination that both Hoover found and now there may be some slight revisions to what had been proposed based on the additional work that Maple Street Commerce completed. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm going to mention some areas where an industrial commercial restriction was proposed. That's the north yard, which is the purple diagonal shading. That's the area that has the heaviest contamination I mentioned before. Also has the area in dark blue, which was the former drum storage area, the hazardous waste drum storage area on the Hoover site. There's also an industrial, commercial, or non-residential use restriction on the area in red, the red square in the south. That's the area I mentioned before where a vapor degreaser was previously present, and Hoover did a cleanup there, and we later found soil gas contamination and a sample in the indoor utility tunnel. There's also a groundwater restriction. I mentioned the off-site area is this light blue shading and extends off-site. That's something that is already in place. Nothing is really going to change based on what we, more recent data that we collected, but the shape of it on-site may change a little bit based on where we collected samples and what we found. So now it includes the southern buildings, strictly for the fact that we had high soil gas concentrations, and it's a preventative measure. Even though groundwater there wasn't contaminated, we still think it's something that's necessary. I guess, we mentioned the vapor intrusion restriction. On this figure I've shown in the orange outline, that looks like a catcher's mitt kind of. That's the area where we've either tested for vapor intrusion or we believe some form of new control is going to be required control is going to be required on a new building that may be constructed. And that really the only thing that's different now is we have a more concrete area of where that may be required based on all this testing that was done. So I've shown just some of the changes from what Hoover had proposed to what we may be requiring in terms of changes. And those are shown in red here. We think that while Hoover proposed the use of barriers before, they didn't really spell it out, and they didn't indicate that there would be ongoing inspection type requirements. So those are things that we'll probably be adding to whatever proposal comes in. Again, I mentioned that we have a more concrete indication of where the vapor intrusion assessment was required and or performed. And one of the other things, an area that previously had no restrictions, we think it's a wise idea to have a soil management restriction on those areas, just in the event that somebody digs up something that we didn't know about that may be contaminated. They should be aware of that potential as they go on with construction.
So, Joe, you updated everybody. What are some of the next steps that you're going to proceed with at the site? Finish up the investigation, further site areas?
Yeah, so the sequence is going to be, as I mentioned, Maple Street Commerce is on site right now doing additional testing under a work plan. Depending on what those results are, I suspect that they will compile all that information, look at the past information by Hoover. They're going to put that all together into a risk package to say how they intend to use these controls and whether additional cleanup is necessary in some areas, in all areas, depending on what they find. Right now we don't see anything that's that alarming. It pretty much confirmed what we had anticipated, with the exception of the problem at the offsite church. That I would anticipate may be coming in a few years, but in the meantime, as the sub-slab system gets installed and comes up and becomes operational. We're going to look at the testing that's performed, check those results, and we're hoping then that will allow that building to be reused and redeveloped as they continue down the process of addressing this site as a whole instead of just a small portion of it for the time being. So I've put our contact information up there. I've also listed Francisco. Rafael mentioned media. Francisco's our guy who's more of the media contact if there are specific questions from news agencies. That's a guy, unless Rafael addresses it, who would be handling those types of questions.
Yeah, so at tonight's meeting, if there's any questions from the press, we can answer those now. If you call the office, we usually refer you to Cisco. Nickname, Rob, Francisco.
So I guess we'll open it up for questions now?
Yeah, so let's begin the process. And incidentally, Joe, so everything that you say, is our website's up to date, right? Because I know you sent a whole bunch of material there. And they have fact sheets with the address.
Yeah, so the fact sheet has
The fact sheet has the address of the website that you go to get a lot of this information, if not all.
Well, and so I'll note something. They're in the process of putting some documents up on the website. And the reason it's not all of them, and the reason it's not up yet,
It's a lot of
one document is 12,000 pages, and so we need to recommend a new computer for the IT person because her computer keeps crashing every time she tries to upload it. So it's in the process. That's one of the big reports that form kind of the basis for this whole investigation, and it includes the large Hoover report as an attachment, which the Hoover report alone I think was maybe 6,000 pages or something. So it's a primary document. It's called the Current Conditions Report, and that's basically a summary of all the historical potential problems that we're looking at.
So with that, let's take questions then. Who's first?
Okay,
Sir?
I do have a question
Oh.
here. I had raised my hand.
I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
I'm concerned about the ball fields that the school systems now control and own.
Sure.
And I was startled to read in the paper here recently that the cap that was put on that, and I knew it had been capped years ago. I don't know exactly when it was put in. But I understand now it doesn't qualify as a permanent cap. So I'm wondering, will they have to remove that temporary cap and then re-overlay it with a more permanent material?
So there's two components of that question. The cap that was installed was crushed stone.
Correct.
And so from a regulatory perspective, that doesn't meet what our requirements are. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not okay. What it means is that we're going to want Maple Street Commerce to provide us with the reason why that's okay. So typically we want asphalt because it's more impermeable. We were out there and we saw the cap. That's as close to asphalt as you can get without it being asphalt. But you know, we would want to see their argument presented to us instead of us.
And the contamination is pretty far down in the
Correct.
soil, and so we don't think anybody's being exposed at this time. So we're going to work through our process of, you know, looking at what we have information-wise and seeing if we do feel that's safe.
I understand it's PCBs and they don't really migrate.
Right.
They just cling to wherever they're at.
Right.
Do you know how thick that crushed limestone cap is?
I understand it was originally installed at 6 inches, but it looks like, you know, the way these things work is when you get a hole, you fill it in, you get another hole, or not a hole, but a depression. And so it looks like it's been added.
Yeah.
It may be thicker. But I think what was put in at that time met the specs that they proposed, and then again, it would be an issue of coming back with a risk assessment to tell us why that's acceptable.
Do you know when that was put in? I've lived here for over 30 years and I don't ever recall all that activity.
2003 maybe, 2002.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That was done by Hoover.
Who was
So then we had a gentleman over here. Sir?
You want-
Yes, just out of curiosity, have you got any soil testing or any monitoring of the old settling ponds on the north side of Building 36.
There's been sampling. I don't know that we specifically did any recently. Are these the ones that are far off in the northwestern corner, or the ones that are closer to?
Just north of the warehouse.
Yeah, so
There are 3 settling ponds back here
yeah,
for process.
wastewater treatment
Yeah.
ponds, yeah, right. There's been a lot of testing done around there, yeah.
They should be fairly clean, but I was just wondering,
And that's what we heard, was that they had been cleaned previously,
they were lying.
and that's great.
That's good, that helps us.
That's a good thing.
You know that?
Because the lining keeps it from getting into the,
Yeah.
deeper and stuff, so.
The linings were replaced about every 5 years, I think.
So yeah, there's been a lot of testing around there, mostly back by Hoover. We've done some vapor intrusion work around there, and there's most of the places on site that we test, we're gonna find some amount of contamination. So there is contamination there. It's at levels that are not as bad as some that we found by the regulated units there where the drums were stored. So.
When were those drums stored? Because I don't ever remember those drums back there.
So they had a permit, they applied for it in 1980, and they tried to start closing it in 1993 or something. And that doesn't necessarily mean they continued to use it up through that time, but it was, throughout the 80s.
Is that indoor storage or is that outdoor storage?
That was outdoor storage, yeah. South of, kind of southeast of Building 36. There were 2 areas where drum storage
It's
was.
back there by Building 15.
Is that, yeah, okay.
So we have some questions in the back.
I said you guys probably know more about the site than.
Joe, yes, this lady, yes.
All right, first I want to thank you for coming and addressing us. You've been very informative. I'm not a chemist, and I'm not a person with the EPA, but I saw one of the slides and it said, I think it was the one with the blue slants for the contaminated ground, where there's vapor intrusion, and you said the groundwater wasn't contaminated. Now my question is, would the groundwater ever get contaminated? Do you know, or is there a life of how long those
I
chemicals
missed the
would be?
first part of that. So usually the way this contamination works is you have contamination in the soil, that water washes through rainwater, and that causes the groundwater plume. And so soil vapors come off of both the soil, the contamination in the soil, and then also in the groundwater, vapors come off of that too. But you're talking, what's the concentration? How deep is it? So there's a number of factors that go into it, and I don't recall the specific area that you were talking about, but
I thought there was a groundwater restriction in that whole area, groundwater use restriction, where they couldn't put a well there for drinking water.
that's correct, yeah. Yeah, and so that was all based on what Hoover found in 2003, and then they predicted how far it would move. And so it's where they found contamination plus a buffer added onto it to make sure that, if Hoover says it's clean here and somebody comes here and puts in a well and it's a contaminated, they didn't want to get that close, so they put a buffer into it. So, you're welcome.
So let's get someone in the back. We'll come back to you, okay? So I think someone in the back had their hand raised. No, I think it was in the back row. I guess not. Over here.
I have 2 questions. Number one, what
Oh,
role?
you're allowed one.
Yeah, if it's the EPA, I'm only allowed a half. What role is Ohio EPA playing? I realize you're probably under the auspices of the Clean Air Act, which was revised in 1990. But my question is Ohio working with you, the Ohio EPA, or are they deferring to the U.S. EPA? That's the first question.
Sure. So EPA is the lead on this site. Hoover approached Ohio EPA to close the drum storage area. The way RCRA closure works, you have to remove all the contamination. Well, as Hoover started doing their work, they found there's no way that they can remove all this contamination. So that then kicked it into the federal program under corrective action, which instead of just addressing that drum storage area, they're addressing the entire site. So we work with Ohio. We use, we refer to Ohio's regulations for what the requirements are, also using our guidance and such, but we coordinated the sampling activities with Ohio. Ultimately, it's going to come down to us buying into what Maple proposes and us also having Ohio buy into it. So it's really kind of two layers of review, which would be a little different than Ohio, which it would be in their hands and it would just be up to them. So now we've got kind of two parties looking at it.
I'm not
Just to
sure.
add to Joe's, we coordinated quite a bit with Ohio EPA when we did off-site sampling of the various, like the church and the Y and that. So we had a lot of conference calls where they're helping us pick sites for sampling. So we do have regular coordination with them, especially when there's an issue that we might think they'd be interested in.
Who will have final jurisdiction is my question.
We will.
Okay.
We'll make the final decision.
Second question, and then I'll finish for the next annual meeting. What are your pollution standards? I mean, there's a lot of information you have on ground, soil, and air with your vapors. Are you using the criteria that's so many parts per million, or have you raised it like we have in the past to so many parts per billion, which, as you know, is very scary, but comparing billions to millions as we used to. We went through this with the Clean Air Act, as you probably know, and with NOx and CO2 and so on. So what criteria or what guidelines are you using here?
So each contaminant has a different criteria, and it's based on how hazardous that contaminant is. Mostly when we're looking at the soil vapor, we're talking about parts per billion range, so it's very small amounts. Some of the soil concentrations that we're looking at, and it depends on what report you look at. Hoover sometimes presented stuff in parts per million, if that's what the lab sent it to them in. It's the same thing, but so if you had a sample that was 1 part per million, it would be 1,000 parts per billion. The criteria that we're measuring it against doesn't change. That number's constant. It's just a conversion of, 1,000 approximately.
Because we went through that with PM for particular matter in Ohio, as you probably know, for a long time we debated that, and we finally settled on whatever the finish site was adequate.
Yeah, I mean, so, and we've also now, we've developed this vapor intrusion screening that maybe Mario can.
We like to report the values in real concentration, so now it's micrograms per cubic meter. You can convert that to parts per billion if you want to, but we like it to be in concentration units. We understand that better, and that's the typical way now. Risk assessment and toxicology reports always refer to those numbers, so we don't like to use parts per billion and parts per million. It's better to use concentration values, we think.
See, things change. Who's next? Yes, ma'am.
Could you give me some history on what entities have done the testing over this time period? I assume it's been different companies or different agencies.
Primarily been 2 with a little bit additional, I believe. So Hoover, they did the bulk of his work through 2003 or 2006, possibly. There may have been a period where Maytag did a little bit of work, and then it's been Maple Street Commerce or IRG since that time.
Is it the same company, or did you hire different people to do the testing?
No, there are different environmental professionals that worked on it. I believe Hoover used, I can't recall, they're a national company, and they're good. They're a good quality company. And I've had great experiences with Hall, who's working for Maple Street Commerce recently here. They are not nationally, but they do a lot of big sites locally, or maybe they are nationally, but they do a lot of big sites locally. So I've seen them more in and around Ohio and in this part of the country, but I guess that's where I work too. So.
Joe, I can add to that. I was on city council here in 2003, and there was a big public hearing and they had volumes and volumes of data on display, big poster boards. So I would guess that a lot of this was put together prior to 2003.
This was Hoover?
Hoover, yes.
Yeah. And so Hoover had a lot of public meetings over the course of time while they were doing their work. That's where we have not done a great job as of recently, but again, we kind of we were at the end of this process, and now we've kind of started it back up. And so we're out here to try to convey what we found in the process. It is a lot of information.
Oh, it's tons, it's tons. And like I said, I think it was all compiled through 2000, well, late 90s. This health order from the Stark County Health Department was dated 03, and of course, that was based on all the findings that they had uncovered.
Yeah.
So that was all done certainly prior to 2003.
And it was, but then there was some off-site testing because there was a question about whether monitored natural attenuation was actually occurring. And so there was a period after that 2003 when they submitted that final report that they conducted some testing off-site to measure concentrations. Yeah.
So we have this lady, ma'am. I think you were next.
I have a few questions. Okay, do you know when the indoor air in the church was tested?
That's, do you want to put that up?
2015, 16?
I would say 2016 through 2017. Once they found contamination, they continued to sample until we understood that we had a favorable result right there. May 2016, it was clean. September 2016, it was very, that's August 2016. So right around 2016, middle of 2016.
I'm curious about the contamination did not need to be addressed for the businesses that are there, or were found in lower levels, so that it,
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that we talk about in terms of contamination, it's the concentration, and then it's the exposure and the duration. Okay? So a lot of these places where I say they're unoccupied, or for example, people were in them an hour a day, all of these criteria that we've developed, they're circled in blue, those are based on how long somebody is breathing that level of contamination. So for a residential property, it assumes
People can be there all the time.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 30, 20.
30 years for cancer and a shorter time.
So you can breathe that for 24 hours a day, straight for 30 years, and you'll have barely a risk of developing any problem. So then, if you look at somebody going down into a basement where that's present at a higher level, but they're only in there for half an hour or an hour, the risk is smaller because your exposure window is not constant.
But at the church, we applied the residential criteria because, well, for one, we knew children were there. And there was a possibility that women of childbearing age may occupy the building for short periods of time. We knew the basement wasn't used continuously. But our protected assumption was we treated the church as if it was a residential area. But coming up with a criteria we wanted them to meet when they put the system.
That's the strictest we have, is the number up there for residential for circled in blue. So that's what we wanted them to meet.
So did we discuss the two standards, for residential or commercial?
I mean, I mentioned it, I didn't go into a lot of detail. The commercial is based on 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for however many years. So that's why you can have a higher level that's acceptable because you're not breathing it as long. So.
And I'm curious about who pays for all this? The testing and the mitigation, if it's off-site.
Yeah. So, I mean, what we've seen is that it's not tremendously off-site. There was some groundwater contamination. People aren't being exposed because there are restrictions in place that prevent people from being exposed to it. The people who pay for the cleanup, the sampling, the testing, whatever controls go in place, that's the property owner. So that's all.
The former Hoover property owner,
Well,
not you.
Hoover,
Yeah.
yes, but now
Maple
Maple
Street.
Street Commerce. So that's all I'm going to do.
You have any other questions?
No.
No? Okay. Ma'am?
Can you clarify just a little bit on next steps? I think you said Maple Street Commerce is on site doing investigations now, then there were some words, and in a couple of years.
Yeah, so they're collecting more information now. They hope that's going to kind of tie everything up in a package that then they can submit to us with a final plan that says, here's where all the contamination is, this is how we're going to address it. We think we have to clean up this area, or we don't think we have to clean up. That'll be coming in about 2 years once they process all this information that they're collecting right now.
So we're kind of at a standstill for a couple of years?
Well, no,
No.
so I
Okay.
mentioned the mitigation system in the West Factory. That's in the process of being installed. I think they've installed below ground stuff. They have to connect it with the risers that will go through the building to the roof, install the fans on the roof to vacuum that material out from underneath, and then implement that sampling so that we can make sure that everything is okay. Then that building should move towards redevelopment.
Awesome, thank you.
Who's next? There's a lady right there.
So along those same lines, we're talking about mitigation for the buildings that are currently occupied. How long is that going to take to get that done? And what risk are the people that are living there?
I can't hear you.
Even with the mic, I have such a quiet voice. What risk are the people that are working there currently? Because my husband works for TrueBridge and he's there every day and working 60-hour weeks right now.
Yeah, and so the results that I put up all show favorable results. In that particular building, the contamination is in the garage. It's not at the upper levels except for those things that are like janitorial supplies. And naphthalene, I don't know that you could sample this room and have there not be naphthalene in it or really anywhere. So his risk working in that building is not increased because the results all show that there's really not contamination there.
So probably one of the things he does to get some exercise during the day is go in the basement to watch. Perhaps he shouldn't do that.
Unless he's going to be there for 18 hours a day for the next 30 years.
Right. Again, it's small, so like people drive into it at park.
Outside's probably better.
What's that?
Still outside's probably better.
Yeah. We don't see it as being an immediate concern, but it is there. So, you know.
And the systems are put in place now to clean the air, how long is that going to take?
And so right now, we're not necessarily looking at those being in any of the other buildings except this new one that's being constructed. I mean, we're still in the process of negotiating that, and we don't know for sure where things are going to go. We may request some additional sampling to confirm what they already got. But this system installation, I'm guessing maybe 6 months in the West Factory that's going through redevelopment. Maybe shorter, maybe more. So.
Who's next? Ann?
What can you tell us about the YMCA Child Development Center that had high levels of PCEs, but even so it wasn't at a level where the EPA in Ohio would say remediation was necessary, but if you use California EPA standards, perhaps some remediation would be required. I'm wondering if that's true, what I've been told, and if the people who bring their kids there know that there could be some issues with the PCE contamination.
So the YMCA samples are here. The concentration of PCE, 3.6 micrograms per meter cubed, 2.7 micrograms per meter cubed. The criteria for residential properties is 42 micrograms per meter cubed. So we're 20 times less than what's acceptable. California has really stringent regulations. I don't know what they are. Screening criteria. We don't follow them. One of the things about this type of science is that it's always evolving. That's one of the reasons we're back out here now, is that things have evolved to where what we thought was okay before, we wanted to check on and make sure, just to confirm. So really, there's not a problem with the YMCA from the way that we look at it.
Very good, thank you. The sealed, I think they're sealed now, the tunnels between the building that's being rehabbed for housing and the YMCA swimming pool area, the actual community building. It would be to the south, yes. And underground, under East Maple, there are tunnels that they had heating and different systems, but now I understand they've been sealed. They talk about pathways along sewer lines and even animal rodent lines. Is there a pathway there that one should be concerned about when you have so many people with health issues perhaps coming to the Y, and then here they're in a building where, I don't know, could there be contamination? Is this an issue that's been discussed?
Sure, so that is a good question. We didn't necessarily look at that specifically, but we are aware that there are tunnels. Some of the ones that have contamination in them, Maple is proposing to address. One of the things that you mentioned, sealing is going to prevent that contamination from going through it to the next level. So the idea of a pathway, the pathway has to be complete, meaning not obstructed. And so if it's sealed, that's favorable. We didn't have any real reason to test that property to the south because all of the groundwater sampling was clean. But we are having now sampling performed south of the buildings along Maple. We're doing soil testing to make sure that the extent is defined, because the way these vapor soil gas in the ground usually works, within about 100 feet of where the contamination is could be a concern. So we want to make sure we know where clean is to the south. So,
thank you.
That's it? Thank you. Any other questions before I come back to this gentleman? I haven't forgotten much. Any other questions? Sir?
Yes, thank you. I want to address the residential area in Ward 1, which would be west of North Main, north of Charlotte, Hillcrest, that area. Is there any concerns with vapor intrusion, groundwater testing, soil sampling in that area for those residents?
This would be far northwest.
It would be west of the Hoover complex. It would be north of Charlotte, that intersection going north.
Okay. So we have tested some private properties there, and I'm not going to discuss the results because those are between the private property owner and us and who collected them. But I can tell you that the results have been favorable from these other locations, meaning at this point we don't see the need for any kind of mitigation system off-site except at the church. So there had been groundwater contamination in that area. It doesn't seem like the contamination is getting from the groundwater into indoor air.
So it's good. Who's next? Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious about the library and City Hall. Are they safe or okay? I can't.
Yeah, and I apologize. I'm trying to put a lot, so I'm trying to be as transparent as I can, so I'm putting all the important information on there, and what happens is you can't read it and there's too much stuff to read.
We'll talk about that later.
Yeah, right. I'm a professional, more is better for me, but, so we sampled the library, all of these off-site. The idea here was we found a problem in the church, and we wanted to sample all of the buildings around the church. So the firehouse was good, the YMCA was good, the Chase Bank was good, the library was good. What was the other one?
City Hall.
We didn't test City Hall because we've got clean. So it's, again, we're trying to define what we found, and we didn't have anything off in that direction by way of contamination. So the library is the closest thing to where City Hall would be.
So Joe, can we put this presentation, is it on the website? 'Cause we could-
I don't know what's on the website right now, but we can.
Yeah,
put this-
we're going to put this presentation on the website so you can read those little numbers. Okay, so who's next? Yes, sir.
I was just wondering, I mean, this is kind of a long shot, but, you know, with radon, let's say for example, you know, I had some radon, and I have a mitigation system in, and I live, you know, south or north or wherever at the site. Just to be extra precautious, if I put a system in just for the heck of it, would that cover some of those things that you're talking about, just for extra precaution?
Yeah, I have a radon system in my own home. When I purchased it, that was the first thing I wanted to know is there asbestos? Is there radon? There was radon, you put the system in and it takes care of anything that's underneath your ground. So if that's contamination, if that's radon, whatever the case may be, it'll evacuate it from below your floor, out through your roof and prevent it from
So,
coming in.
and I think also, so you know that in the Midwest, we have, like I live in Wisconsin and radon is all over the place. So it's out there, especially in the Midwest. So, I mean, my son also had to bought a new house and he had to put in a radon system. So, I mean, it's a common occurrence. Who's next?
Somebody was talking about final jurisdiction, and the gentleman back here said we do. Who's we?
We EPA.
Oh, okay.
US EPA.
US, okay. Thank you.
That's my boss.
He's not my boss, he's his boss. Let's make that clear.
I was just wondering, in the future, if the Hoover Company gets developed as they're planning with the housing and so forth, what obligations the people responsible have to people before they sign a lease to say, this is what's underneath?
Sure, and first of all, it's a legal argument, but typically what we see is that there is something in the lease that identifies people of this potential, of the potential for samples to be collected if needed. There are protections built into rental and lease agreements for that exact type of thing.
And some states actually have laws that say that if you know you have an issue with your house, environmental, you're obligated to, before you sell it, mention that and fix the problem. So there's also at the state level, there's two sets of laws. There's state level laws and there's federal laws. But you can't abide by the federal law and not abide by the state law. So there are things to protect you out there. You should check to see. I'm not sure if Ohio has that. I think they do actually. I kind of think they.
Uniform environmental covenant law.
Yeah.
So that's when Joe was talking about the restrictions on the property. That's what will be part of the final remedy. Is that these things will be part of the property records.
Right. It becomes part of the lease.
Right.
Yes. All right. Who's next?
I have another question.
Yes, sir.
I have the Stark County Health Resolution that was passed in '02. That's why I was sure that a lot of this work was done prior to '03 anyway. And it defines the boundaries. Are you comfortable with these existing boundaries? Has this pollution moved beyond those boundaries, or is it contracted any?
We have no, well, if it's changed, it's contracted. I'm comfortable with the boundaries.
Okay.
I understand that as a maximum extent of possible contamination, and that is retracted some. That said, there's work going on. This is why nobody wants to do sampling, is because every time you do a sample, you might find something you didn't expect. But we're pretty confident that things are contained within the area that it was defined.
And do you know if it's dissipating, reducing in concentrations?
Yeah, and that's one of the slides.
On that border?
That's one of the slides that I had up there. Again, so at that border, it wasn't contaminated. That was a area where it was predicted that it could migrate to. But at that, the offsite area, apologize here. So at the offsite area there, it has been reducing. This is going down, I don't know if it's Viking or Charlotte, I apologize. The concentrations here, 2006, chemical was 770. 2017, it's 88.
Okay.
So we have a lot of information that indicates it's
Thank you.
reducing.
Yes, sir, in red.
Yeah, two questions. One, there's no place on site that product recovery is still an option. And the second one is the mitigation system that you're putting on site. Do you think that's going to affect the off-site migration?
The system on site should not affect off-site migration, first of all, with the last question. You're drawing a vapor through the building, and it's not a suction that's strong enough to change anything below ground. It's really just kind of what's below the floor. What was the first part? Oh, product, yeah. So there had been product on site. Hoover did some cleanup related to that product. Right now, we don't think that there is any product. We haven't seen any in any of the wells. That is something, that's one of the hurdles that you have to get past to allow the use of some of this risk type of work, is that you can't have free product because it can migrate. So if it's encountered during sampling, that's something we're going to have to address, but right now it doesn't look like there is any. So.
Has the softball field been checked? When they were building that, they took out some big, ugly, very smelly, black, I don't know what it was. They wouldn't tell us. I went over and asked. I lived next door to it. So have they been checked?
Work was done in the softball fields, not recently. This is work that was done by Hoover previously. Generally, there is some contamination. It's closer to where the parking lot is. There's not a tremendous amount of contamination that we're aware of anywhere else in the ball fields.
Yeah, because this was between the two fields, back by the fence for the Hoover Company.
Okay.
And it was big and it was ugly and it stunk like death. Now, I know that the stadium parking lot was encapsulated when I worked over at the bus garage. But that keeps washing down onto the sidewalk. And it's never cleared off the sidewalk because I walk up there all the time. So I was wondering if they're going to put more encapsulation on there, or if it's full of potholes in there.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I mean, that might be more of an issue that the school board, it may not necessarily be an environmental. I mean, I can only look at things from, do I have to protect human health in terms of the contamination? So right now, we think that things are under control there, and I don't know that I would be able to do anything. Again, there is a portion of the site where we may have to reevaluate, resubmit the risk assessment for that area that we knew contamination was present, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have to dig anything up or do anything right now.
Or do they have responsibility for it? Do they have responsibility for it?
It's a legal question.
Yeah.
Did I hear who was responsible for that?
Yeah, that's, I said, that's a legal question.
Yeah. It's,
and I'm not an attorney.
I wondered if any study had been done about health issues of anyone in the area around where contamination may have been. In particular, I'm thinking of cancer, and I know that you can do a cancer risk if you, from some of your data. I wonder if anyone's produced a number of what's the cancer risk. I did hear you say it was low in some areas. You have to have lived there in these homes for 18 hours a day or 24 and be there for 30 years. This is a community where people worked at Hoover for years. My immediate family, over 100 years at that company. I live near it. I've lived in our house for 60 years personally. And yes, I have cancer. On 5 houses, or 4 houses on my street next to me, across from me, 5 of us, cancer. I'm not saying this is a connection. Cancer's everywhere. We all know people with cancer. I'm just saying, who might think this is a time to survey, scientifically study, determine connection, if one exists? Is this the moral thing to do?
Yeah, is there a cancer cluster?
Yes. So first of all, I'm sorry about anything that you are or have gone through. It's terrible, and I can't imagine what it would be. Me? Okay. In terms of a health study like that, that's something that's done more by
Local health department. That's usually the purview of the state and local health departments. EPA doesn't usually do direct epidemiology population studies. We're concentrating on site investigations and coming up with remediation. But if you feel strongly about it, I would approach your county health department and the state of Ohio health department, get your concerns out to them, and they really should be helping address those issues. And I'm not aware of any study that's been performed.
And if there was an issue at the local health department, the CDC would know about it. Because that's one, right, it goes from the local health department to your Ohio, what is it, they call it, Ohio Department of Health. And then from there it goes to the CDC. Usually the Ohio Department of Health, the Michigan Department of Health, they have contracts, subcontracts with the CDC. So there are mechanisms to check. You know, those are like, they're called cancer clusters. You've heard that. Yeah, but they have to be proven.
They're very, very hard to prove.
Yeah, they're extremely hard to prove, right. So
but maybe you don't have to prove it so much as to be transparent that there could be some link or possibility or something that would make us do even more. As they mentioned, the radon system that they put it in just because it might be a good idea. I'm just going for transparency. I'm not creating a link, but it is tough when you see so many, and so many of us have been linked to the Hoover Company for all of our lives.
yes.
And so I think I'm remiss if I don't bring it up like it's the elephant in the room.
And it's difficult because they handle those chemicals, you know, in the air in places that people work, right? So you could, if you work there and handle those types of materials, there's a workplace issue. You mentioned radon. I know Ohio has radon problems. It's just, you can't get around it. And if you haven't had your home sampled, I suggest you do it. It's inexpensive, and it can answer a question that can maybe save you from getting the home.
I'm the other occupant in the house, and I too have had cancer, so we're batting 100% here.
So I never worked or lived near a factory. I had cancer. So it's like the lady said, a lot of people have various, you know, there's cancer out there everywhere. So it's hard to really pinpoint it. It really is.
Coincidence, not necessarily cause and effect.
Well, there's contamination everywhere.
Yeah, I'm afraid.
I'm glad you guys do what you do.
Well, we're trying. Who else? Who else? Yes, ma'am.
I just wonder if anybody from if anyone from Maple Street is here tonight. I'm just curious.
No, this is an EPA meeting.
Oh. Public is invited.
There are people here, but we're not asking them to be involved in it. You know, unless there's something specific that comes up. Sorry.
It's all right.
It's correct in record. It's a public availability session, so,
Yeah, so we really
they're
can't
welcome
keep
to come
anybody
too,
out.
right? So
Anyone is
Yeah.
welcome. We just don't have to, if you're not on the agenda, we don't have to let them talk. Gotta be on the agenda. Who else? I know you had a question. I'm talking to this gentleman right here. Yes, you.
More of a statement.
All right, statement's fine.
The area that she was referring to up by the wall fields, back toward the Hoover complex, years ago, that was a wetland. And I'm just wondering how much possibly you're getting contamination from that thing and so forth from that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the lady over here mentioned odors. I mean, if it's a wetland and you have things decaying, there's a good possibility maybe some of that's related to that. I don't know that it would be the cause of contamination, but
It's flexible.
yeah, it could be. I mean, all the low places are, and that's one of the reasons things are moving to the west is it's lower, right? So groundwater wants to move at the least resistance.
So the tree that goes down through Park Park, basically starts right about where those septic pots are.
Who else? Anybody else have a question? Yes, ma'am.
The people currently working in the Hoover complex, are they being notified if there's any risk to their health? Is there any,
Sure. So the way this works is that Maple Street Commerce leases the building. Maple Street Commerce notifies the people who lease the space. That becomes their responsibility for notifications, unless there's such a big problem that we have to step in or pull the health department, for example, in to make people
Notifies them of what?
of a concern. Yeah.
Of a concern of the property they're leasing.
So if we had a concern, we would probably be out doing some outreach. But since it was below our screening levels, we don't do outreach. Is that fair to say?
they're not
Yeah,
required, they're not required?
Well, if
to
there's,
have-
well, so the thing is, so why put someone on alert if, for something that is not, you know, it is not really endangering their health? Okay, so why give them a false warning? You know, so the way we do things is it's got to be supported by the data we collect. And so that's the same evidence we would take to a judge if someone sued us. So everything that we're saying here, we would share this with the judge as well, and probably in even more detail. So, you know, we feel pretty safe when we come to a meeting like this, and we do X, Y, Z, and we say we've done this, and these are the results of the data results. It's because we've done our homework. So we feel kind of safe that way, and I think you should too. Right.
And that's kind of the purpose of this meeting too, is to share what we have.
Exactly.
When we worked with Mayor L, well, setting up this meeting, it was so we can communicate the sampling that's been done and share that with the public. So you could ask questions of us.
And one thing also that Joe mentioned, when we finally do come up with a final plan for the cleanup, so there's a 30-day comment period, or we can make it a 45-day comment period, whatever you know, Joe decides, or the section decides. There's a comment period at which you will have the opportunity to see what the decision is, and you can make comments about that. You know, and if push comes to shove, we could have another public meeting in which you could make your comments. So you can write them in to us, or you can put them up on our website to us, send them to us, or if you have a meeting, we'll have someone here taking the notes of that meeting and your questions as well. And so all those comments that we get before we issue the final decision, there will be an answer to your questions. That's all done jointly together.
And one thing I would add to that, the difference between a project like this one where we didn't find a problem and we're out here, or we found a problem in one property and we're out here a couple years later having dealt with that one property, as opposed to some that he deals with where you go out, you sample, and there's a problem, and we're out in the community right away telling people what's going on, informing them, telling them there may be vapor mitigation systems going in. It's a completely different situation to what we have going on.
And if it really gets bad, we call it Superfund. And they're the guys that come in immediately and begin to clean up. And we don't have to look for the culprits right away either. They have the money to do that. So.
Just a quick statement. If you take a look at the size of the complex that the Hoover Company had, and you compare it to all the other industrial sites in Stark County, you probably would look at the Hoover site as practically the best in the whole area.
Yeah. I'm sure, it's a big site.
But I'm just talking about cleanliness and so forth. And, you
in
have
terms of-
far less problems here than you would anyplace else.
You have a nice town here. I've been to
believe it's
lots of
awesome.
towns. You have a nice town.
How many communities in this country had a major manufacturer on the square surrounded by residential?
There are some, and there are some with a lot worse problems than there
Very
are.
few you'll find as good as this was.
Right. Do you have a link to your data that you said?
Yeah, there's a fact sheet.
If anyone didn't get this when they came in, there's more.
Oh, it's on that, okay.
Yeah, so I'll know, that's the website that's gonna wind up having all of the information related to the Hoover site. It's gonna have various reports linked to it. It doesn't yet because of some of the trouble that our IT person's having, but I'll also put the slides up here and link to this so that they're on the website and you can guys can go through it.
Okay, I'll get that on my.
So are there any other questions that we have? Anything at all? So once, twice, 3 times you're out, we're done.
And the 4th time, if you need to contact us, you can get us
Yeah.
an email.
You'd always contact us. Thank you so much for coming. Did you have something to say?
What's the name of that church? The one on the front, it's the one by the fire station.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not right. Yes, we're looking at the front of the church. So there was one level that was found for some reason.
I want to thank you. I'm Jim McCarthy.